So this morning, I'm going to conclude the series that we began a month ago on the Lord's Prayer using the book by John Dominic Crossan, The Greatest Prayer, Rediscovering the Revolutionary Message of the Lord's Prayer. So let me say a few things about Crossan first. I've already shared with you that he is a former Dominican priest until he got married. For the first 30 years of his life as a Dominican priest, would have committed his life to the study of the lifetimes, history, archaeology, languages of the Middle East. At the same time, he is Irish. And he has been accused by one person anyway, of seeing the history of the Middle East through the lens of his own experience as an Irishman. But I think it's not such a bad accusation. Because what Crossan identified as a scholar, probably more than anyone else of this era, is that you cannot completely comprehend the teachings of this Rabbi Jesus unless you understand the world in which he was living. And he was living in a world that was occupied by Rome. And he understood what that meant. Why did he understand it? Because he was Irish. And who occupied Ireland? The Empire, right? The British Empire. And we forget, and a lot of it has been swept under the table, the incredible abuses of the Irish people. I know one little known fact is, in fact, the Irish were traded as slaves while Britain was in charge of them. I think they only got $5 for each, or £5 for each Irish slave. They got 50 pounds from slaves from Africa. So let's remember what it means to live in the grips of the empire, all right? We're a long way from that. So, as Crossan is looking at the empire, looking at the world in which Jesus lives, he is identifying, as he could in his own country and how we can continue to do so, the two biggest challenges to survival and abundant life in that era. Two, and they haven't changed. Violence and poverty. And sometimes they go hand in hand. Or violence then creates poverty. Poverty creates violence. We understand that cycle, if only just from looking in from the outside. So I deeply appreciate some of the scholarship that he has done by looking more deeply at the world in which Jesus was born. So we have this Lord's Prayer. I will say two things for those of you who haven't been walking the entire journey with us. The first thing Jesus would say is that in calling God Father, we are identifying God within that Judaic-Christian tradition as a householder. And there was a definition of the just householder in that tradition, and that is, if you were responsible for the household, then you had to ensure, and it was men in that era, but we know that, this was a patriarchal society, you were responsible for ensuring that everyone in your household thrived. And not just every person, not just the people you were related to. Your slaves, the people who came seeking refuge from violence, the animals, and I know most of us forget, even the land. The land is to get break every 7 years. So God is, in just starting that prayer with those two words, Our Father, is saying, the person or the character that we need to give to this mystery we call God is reminiscent of a householder who is prepared to ensure that everyone in the household gets what they need. All right. And that householder is held up in contrast to Caesar, who is not that concerned that everyone under his care gets what they need. So Crossan is constantly holding these two in tension, and he would argue that, in fact, Jesus does the same thing. The next thing he suggests is that if you are going to pray the Lord's Prayer, you can't just be standing there with your arms open expecting God to move. You are, in fact, standing in a place where you join the collective community of the faithful to serve as the householder. So that we as this community then are required to ask ourselves, wow, how do we ensure that those in our midst, under our care, receive what they need? So, the line that we're looking at today is, I'll give you the King James Version, and then I'll give you the other version. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Or the new RSV, the New Revised Standard Version. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. And I, for one, am fascinated by Crossan's vision of this prayer. So, this is what Crossan thinks we have to understand in order to make the journey with him to how he understands this last petition within this prayer. He tells us that Rome executed 3 major assaults on the country of Israel. It exercised those major assaults because it was just tired of all those Jewish people standing up and trying to change things or trying to get power. So, just one more piece of history. So, in the entire Roman Empire, the religion of the Romans insisted that Caesar was God, all right? So, if you were in the empire, you were required to acknowledge Caesar as divine God. The Romans made allowances for Israel because Israel was not going to do that. They had wrestled with their history, and they were going to stand in this place and say, no, we will live obediently, we will pay taxes, we won't make any trouble, but we are not going to bow down and worship Caesar. All right? So Rome had already made allowances for this puny little country called Israel. Yet every once in a while, you can imagine where that would go. So you would have the religious zealots, right, who just feel that it was their responsibility to bring on the real kingdom of God. And honestly, God was going to be on their side one of these days, and one of these days they were going to be able to crush Rome. Well, what does history tell us about those initiatives? So there would be those who, from a very religious and theological perspective, wanted Rome out of there. And then there were those who, from a very economic perspective, wanted Rome out of there. I shared last week that shortly before the time that Jesus was born, Rome had built a city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. Why? Because the Sea of Galilee had fish, and it just gave Rome more access to the fish. Well, what does that do to all of those little fishermen who have been kind of barely able to fish for their own daily bread, right? So it wasn't just the fact that they were expected to consider Caesar as God, but really that Rome was infringing on their ability to feed themselves. So for all kinds of reasons, you can understand why there would have been uprisings from time to time within the country of Israel. Some of them were nonviolent, some of them were violent. Rome didn't care. Rome didn't care if it was a nonviolent protest. Rome was going to come down. So there were 3 major assaults, and the first one happened in 4 BCE, which would have been about the time that Jesus was born. The city of Sepphoris, which was 4 miles down the road from Galilee, was completely wiped out. And we know what comes with that, don't we? 1,500 to 2,000 Roman soldiers marching down the road in full regalia, and everything in their way gets trampled, slaughtered. Men get killed, women get raped, children get taken into slavery. It was not an easy time to be alive. So I think what Crossan is suggesting, and I think he's right, is that in the minds of those who were living in Galilee, most of their lives would be determined from that time, after the Romans came, right? So, within the memory of this community called Israel is this history of assault and rape and abuse. And what does that do to somebody, right? Apart from all the struggles of having to get daily bread. And then being reminded on a daily basis that you're still paying your taxes to Rome. And the guy at the corner, who's the Roman soldier, is still there to pay attention to you just to make sure that you stay in your place. So, Crossan takes about 12 pages to suggest the following. He says, in that era, bread for today. If you wanted to survive, you needed to eat. So these 3 petitions, bread for today, give us this day our daily bread, was central to thriving and surviving. And please, no debt for tomorrow. We talked about this last week. In that culture, if you were in debt to somebody, they had the right to take you then as a slave. So, you didn't want to be in debt. You couldn't just declare bankruptcy. You had to very often pay with your life, all right? So these small-time farmers and fishermen, they didn't want any debt. It would destroy their lives and their families, right? So, bread for today. Let us be able to feed ourselves, please. Let us try and keep let us try and be able to sustain ourselves so that we don't owe anybody anything, because it'll be our lives. And he's suggesting that 3rd petition, save us from the temptation, and this is what he suggests. Save us from the temptation of constantly having to, how am I going to put this? If you are constantly living in enemy territory, then you're constantly having to pull yourself out of that world that says them and us. And it's a world that you're allowed to identify as them and us. So if there is constant resentment in your heart, if there's constant need to have to stay on top of your own propensity to strike back, right? Because if Jesus has been living in this community for 30 years, he's had a lot of time to think about, if we are constantly living as those who are being held under somebody else's thumb, what does this do to us spiritually, and how are we going to function so that we can sleep at night and get through the day without constantly wanting to just hit somebody? So he's suggesting that temptation, that his community constantly needs to be caught that there's always going to be a temptation to fight back. And yet, fighting back was going to make things absolutely worse. So I think he is suggesting for us to live for us to walk another way of life where we're not constantly in this tit for tat, we have got to rise above our present situation and somehow connect with a deeper place inside of ourselves that recognizes that might makes right, or an eye for an eye is not going to get us anywhere. Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense that when you're living in the occupied territory, and there's all kinds of reasons why you might want to fight back. I mean, look at Ireland under Britain. Look at any country under Britain. That you may have every right to want things to change, but to make efforts to get them to change is just going to end in an incredible loss of life. So fast forward 65 years, Rome went into Jerusalem and completely razed the temple. And that was the end of Judaism as we knew it in that time. So I think that Jesus was saying, look, striking back, fighting back against the empire is only going to lead to more loss of life. There has got to be another way. So here's a conclusion. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish survivor of Hitler's concentration camps, wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning, as a means of looking at that experience of surviving the concentration camp and determining what it was within people who survived that enabled them to survive. And what he suggests that in order to survive in such horrendous circumstances, a person needs to recognize their own power to create an alternative reality within. And this reality then provides the means to rise above the horror. It is, of course, a bit more complex than that, but what Frankl knows because of his own experience is that we can create within us an alternative story, and in fact, we might survive because of that story. I think that from Crossan's perspective, the invitation of the Lord's Prayer is an invitation to live in another story, supported by a very different worldview. And the challenge for prosperous 21st century Christians, for whom the world is quite acceptable the way it is that it then becomes really hard to comprehend that radical leap that Jesus is inviting his community to make. I mean, here, we can preach all we want. Oh, we all know an eye for an eye doesn't work. Well, we have the luxury from a place of peace to be able to say that we would never strike back if somebody struck us, right? But how often does that happen? We simply do not live with the kind of violence that was rampant in the ancient world. And so I was thinking to myself, then what is the invitation to us this day? How might these ancient words kind of come out of their context and speak to our own context? So there are two different scenarios, and you choose which one you think is most meaningful to consider. In the summer of 1990, I found myself living 3 blocks from the barricade that was put up as a result of the Mohawk crisis. So members of my community, 45,000 people in Chateauguay, the major artery to their place of Montreal was then blocked. And it was very interesting to me to observe how quickly violence started to break out at the barricade, how quickly people were burning effigies of Mohawk people, how quickly we became the victim without having any kind of historical memory of how long the Mohawks in that region had been victim to the empire that subdued them. So it seems to me that as we watch our indigenous peoples throughout North America rise up and say no to empire, there is a propensity on behalf of empire to come down with violence. We've seen it in this country. We've seen it in the country to the south of us, and more recently. So I invite you to think about how are we thinking about the role of nonviolent resistance in those contexts? But here's something much closer to home. A friend of mine just shared with me, going through a separation, that at the end of the day, he said, Lynne, the only person that we can work on is ourselves. We may be angry, hurt, etc., have all kinds of reasons to blame the other person for being wrong. But at the end of the day, the only universe that we can affect is the one in here. So I think at the end of the day, that's what Jesus is telling his people. We have got to find an alternative way of living together, even in the midst of the most dire of circumstances, so that the best of who we are continues to shine.